Hello and welcome to this BSI webinar, Clinical Masterclass Series, Preparing a Clinical Evaluation Report, Part 2. This is our second Clinical Masterclass Series and this is the third webinar of this series. This webinar is a follow-up webinar to Preparing a Clinical Evaluation Report, Part 1, which was presented on the 25th of January. The webinar will be presented by Richard Holbrow, Head of Clinical Compliance. Sheila Walsh, Clinical Regulatory Lead, will be supporting us throughout the webinar with answering as many questions as she can. There'll also be a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Prior to his role at BSI, Richard worked as a clinical physiologist for 16 years within the NHS, specialising in implantable cardiac devices and electrophysiology. Richard joined BSI in 2018, bringing his clinical expertise and passion for clinical data to the organisation. Sheila Walsh is the Clinical Regulatory Lead working in the Clinical Compliance team. Sheila joined BSI in 2007 and has held various technical and clinical review and leadership roles. In her current position, she is responsible for providing clinical regulatory support to the operational teams. Please ask questions during the presentation via the question box in your control panel, and we'll get to as many as we can at the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. A link with access to the recording and slides will come from GoToWebinar within 48 hours, so please look out for this email. So thank you for your participation, and I'll now hand you over to Richard, and we really hope you enjoyed the webinar. Thank you.
Hi, thanks Natalie, and welcome everybody, as Natalie said, to the session 2 of the Clinical Evaluation Report, which is overall session 3 of the Clinical Masterclass. So again, following on from our last webinar, we're going to be talking a little bit about how best to document clinical investigations. Then we're going to talk about stratification of data and the analysis behind that, and also consider some benefit risk assessments and how best to document those and what should be considered within a benefit risk statement. And Article 6110, we know that there are manufacturers out there, those devices that where clinical data may be deemed inappropriate, and how best you should present any information for those devices to the notified body. We'll also look at sort of consideration of other activities to the updates of the clinical evaluation report, more of a process overview about how things should be considered, particularly when you update certain documentation and the impact to other processes and documentation that may be required. So we're going to begin by documenting clinical investigations. So under the MDR, it is now mandatory for all new class 3 and implantable devices to have clinical investigations. And there are some exemptions, and those would be devices that are considered well-established technology. So that's your sutures, staples, pins, etc., or listed in Article 61, paragraph 6b, or where perhaps there is a successful claim of equivalence, or where there are modifications made to a device already marketed by the same manufacturer. This really hasn't changed much from the MDD, because in fact there are statements in the MDD that talk about the need for clinical investigations for class 3 and implantable devices. But today we're going to talk about how best to consider the analysis and documentation of these clinical investigations within your clinical evaluation report, and also consider the documentation that should be provided. So it is worth saying though, just because class 3 and implantable devices are told that they should perform clinical investigations for the MDR, there are sometimes we do see that interpreted as that class 2A and 2B non-implantable do not require clinical investigations, and that actually is incorrect. Really, it should be given consideration, should be given to the device under the evaluation, the performance and claims made to the device to make sure that whether or not a clinical investigation is appropriate. So really, consideration still needs to be given to class 2A and 2B non-implantable devices. And as part of our job as a notified body is to evaluate all that clinical investigation data as part of the conformity assessment, and make sure that there is sufficient clinical detail on those clinical investigations within the clinical evaluation report, and make sure that the reviewer or our evaluators at the notified body can sufficiently document their evaluation. So the 26th of May 2021 was obviously a very important date, but in the context of clinical investigations, it was important that any clinical investigation initiated on or after the 26th of May needs to fulfill the requirements of Article 62 to 82 of the MDR and Annex 15. That saying though, there is guidance, MDCG guidance, that talks about the fact that clinical investigations initiated before the 26th of May 2021 should have been conducted to the Medical Device Directive or ISO 14155. Now, ISO 14155 is the standard for clinical investigations of medical devices in human subjects, and it was actually updated recently in 2020, and that was really to reflect the changes that were being introduced under the MDR2 clinical investigations. So compliance to ISO 14155 2020 version is actually considered compliance to the medical device regulation. Although we are yet to see this formally adopted or a formal announcement from the European Commission, we know that it has been adopted for or at the time was adopted for the Active Implantable Medical Device Directive. There is some statements out there, but still as notified bodies, we are still waiting for that to be adopted, but that doesn't say you cannot use ISO 14155 right now. It is still applicable and should still be considered, particularly where perhaps investigations are being conducted outside of the EU. Always alongside ISO 14155, and those that are familiar with that standard will know, although it is an international standard, there are some additional considerations that should be thought about in terms of local authority requirements too. So it's important to understand what the role of the notified body is in regards to clinical investigations and what the role of the competent authority is, because often we have to sort of align ourselves obviously to what the competent authority expectations are, but our review process is slightly different to what the competent authorities are, and it's quite important because that will feed into the rest of the slides that we'll be presenting as part of this session. The competent authority is responsible obviously for the approval and assessment of the clinical investigation plan, and then they're also responsible for ensuring that you as the manufacturer fulfill your obligations during the clinical investigation, and responsible for your serious adverse event reporting and making sure that all appropriate actions are followed up. The notified body for our role really is when it comes to the conformity assessment, because within this context we're talking about clinical investigations that are being done or performed to develop towards CE marking. Then really our role as a notified body is to make sure that that data that's been presented for the conformity assessment has been obtained legally and in a responsible manner. The notified body needs to ensure that the clinical data, of course, sufficiently supports the intended purpose for the conformity assessment. And as I said, it's important to clarify this because what we are looking for in terms of the clinical investigation design and the results of that clinical investigation is really the justifications as to why that method was chosen and an understanding of what has happened historically. So really there are overall seven areas that we consider with our assessment as a notified body of clinical investigations, and you'll see those on the left-hand side of the screen. We'll talk through each of one of those and what considerations the notified body is looking for when it comes to you documenting your clinical investigations within your clinical evaluation report. So the first one is ethics, and sorry, Annex 15, Chapter 1, Section 1 of the Medical Device Regulation requires that clinical investigations have been carried out in accordance with recognized ethical principles. And really those ethical principles and plans need to be clear from the initial study design right through, in fact, to the publication of the results of your clinical study. And that really is the notified body wants to make sure that ethical considerations be given across the whole study to release of results. Ethics and the practice of obtaining consent should be always considered including vulnerable populations. So if your study design, for example, has included breastfeeding or pregnant women, then really, we need to make sure that there is some documented ethical approval specific to that vulnerable group within your ethics no objection or ethics submission, ethics committee submission. And it's worth looking at Article 63 to 69 of the MDR because they do highlight those vulnerable populations, and also with reference to damage compensation as well. Some new introductions under the medical device regulation. What is recognized ethical principles? Well, really that is the most recent version of the Declaration of Helsinki. And again, we expect that the ethics submission is referenced in the Declaration of Helsinki, and the performance will be, or the conduct of the clinical investigation will be in accordance to that declaration. And again, really what we're looking for as a notified body is clear evidence that there is no objection from the ethics committee. And ideally, also a sample of the consent form is always required for conformity assessment. And again, think about that consent form where perhaps there are vulnerable populations and how you may have had to obtain consent, particularly in the case of clinical investigations of children or incapacitated subjects. Section 2, again, of the MDR talks really about study design, and it reports that Annex 15 of the MDR discusses the need for the procedures and study design to be appropriate to the device under investigation, or I should say devices under investigation, apologies. So really what we're always looking for is, why have you chosen that study design? So when reporting your clinical investigation and your clinical evaluation report, really think about the justification and what is behind the reason for considering that study. And I think one of the things we often see is that when a clinical investigation is conducted, from the actual moments of the plan right through to actually implementing and getting your final results can be many, many years. And sometimes technology moves on, sometimes state of the art moves on. And really what we're trying to make sure that, or trying to get an understanding of, is why at that particular point in time did you choose that type of investigation? We know, certainly from my clinical experience, whenever clinical investigation results were presented to me, it would always be questions I would always ask were around, well, why didn't you consider this? Why didn't you consider that? It is very difficult to design the perfect study, but it's still, you still should justify why you chose that method. And so again, really thinking about those factors about why you chose single-blinded versus double-blinded versus retrospective versus prospective. And also think about, why that specific study design was chosen, and is it because it was more likely to confirm or refute the claims related to safety and performance than other designs of investigations? Also, what's also helpful to the notified body is where you actually talk about the clinical investigations for maybe similar devices, where you say, well, actually, typically for this group of devices, historically, these 5 devices have had this style of investigation that allows a better comparative result of that clinical investigation. So really just trying to sort of demonstrate that for this particular type of technology, this is the type of study design that is typically used to generate that. And if we start to see those justifications through your clinical evaluation report, that's really helpful. The third area that we focus on as notified bodies is patient populations. And Annex 15, Section 2.4 of the MDR requires that clinical investigations are performed in a clinical environment that is representative of the intended normal conditions of use of the device in the target patient population. So patient population should really be clearly described for the investigation, and it should be defined in terms of the stage and severity of the disease, considering the age of those people and particularly age ranges and where the mean age may exist within that patient population. Also thinking about if any comorbidities were included within the study design of that patient population, and also thinking about how that compares to your claimed intended purpose. And really, this patient population selection should really align to what you had demonstrated in your clinical evaluation plan. There should be that consistency that in your clinical evaluation plan, you identify this specific patient population, and within your study design, you've enacted that and followed that through. Consideration and justification should always be given to why certain inclusion exclusion criteria have been selected. I think that's one of my sort of bugbearers with clinical investigations, is often the inclusion and exclusion criteria is very strict and doesn't really reflect what is going to happen to the device when actually placed on the market. So for me, real world evidence, I have a real passion for that, but I think it's important to sort of highlight why you chose that inclusion exclusion criteria and actually give justifications as to why that device may end up going into a patient with that exclusion criteria. One of the common areas we often see is where perhaps patients have been exposed to previous treatments or diagnosis methods of a particular in a hospital setting are suddenly excluded within the clinical investigation. And whilst we understand the clinical investigation is there to demonstrate the effectiveness of the device, it's important to think about, well, actually, when this device is released on the market, there are going to be patients who would have had those previous treatments that were excluded from the study that now are going to be open or potentially open to the device. So it's important to think about that and really give some solid justification as to that inclusion exclusion criteria and how it could differ when the device is limited. Does it mean that's wrong? We understand that is the practice of clinical investigations, but again, good solid documentation of this is very helpful. The next area we're going to look at is patient numbers. And I think one of the most common questions we get as a notified body is, how many patients are you looking for in a study? In our post-market clinical follow-up study, what is the notified body looking for? Well, it's not about what we are looking for. It's about what you should think is appropriate in terms of your statistical analysis plan. And what has been proven through that statistical calculation is going to give you a validated result. And section 2.1 of Annex 15 of the MDR says quite clearly that the investigation shall include a minimum number of observations to guarantee scientific validity. It's important to note that the MDR says observations are not subjects, because sometimes to repeat something on a same individual can still be considered an observation, and that can still formulate a statistical analysis plan in certain situations with certain devices. So just note that reference to that term. Whenever we receive your clinical investigation plan as part of the conformity assessment, we always need to see a statistical analysis plan as well, and it should be provided alongside the clinical investigation plan for the conformity assessment. It's really important that you provide the strong rationale as to why your statistical analysis plan design has been chosen and the type of methodology that's behind it. It's always important to make sure that your biased statistician, for example, has had input into that justification and can clearly demonstrate why you've come up with that particular design. It's worth noting, I think we can all honestly say that, if you get the right statistician with the right statistical methodology, you can actually sort of skew the statistics to give you the results you need. And we do see that from time to time, that certain unusual statistical methods are used. And if they are sort of rare methods, just note that, we aren't, our reviewers have some statistical knowledge, but are not experts. And often then when we do go down the route where we see these very unusual statistical methods being used, that we are likely to have to engage a expert biostatistician to have a review of that statistical analysis plan. But where you use perhaps more common statistical methods, that is normally accepted and normally doesn't require the involvement of an expert biostatistician. The next area is objectives and endpoints, and section 2.6 of Annex 15 requires that clinical investigations will address the intended purpose, clinical benefits, performance and safety, and that all endpoints are scientifically validated. The primary endpoint shall be appropriate and clinically relevant. What we often see at the notified body with submissions is the fact that people get very excited. They get their results from a feasibility study and they decide to submit that to the notified body. A feasibility study is not a confirmatory investigation, okay? And it doesn't confirm the intended purpose, clinical benefit, performance and safety. A feasibility study is usually focused on safety. It's worth noting that the MDR specifically requests that the primary endpoint of a confirmatory investigation should reflect the clinical benefit and be clinically relevant, and that means quantifiable and hold meaningful benefit. As I said, primary endpoints that are safety orientated are typically associated with feasibility studies. And the CR should always discuss why those endpoints were chosen and how they've been scientifically validated. So make sure that in your clinical evaluation report, when you have your list of objectives and endpoints, that you provide, for each one, you provide a rationale and justification and how that's been scientifically validated with reference to any particular articles, etc. Length of follow-up and intervals. Well, Section 2.2 and 2.3 of Annex 15 does discuss the need for the research methodologies and procedures to be appropriate to the device under evaluation, and specifically says consideration should be given to the follow-up methods and intervals between data collection. So to make sure that your data collection points are obviously appropriate, and the duration of the follow-up should be appropriate to the device to make sure that it captures the correct data and the correct time points. One of the things that we often see is that the duration of follow-up in a study often is looking at safety, and it's focused, and rightly so, but people often forget what are those performance points at that follow-up as well. So really making sure that when you're documenting that, why have you chosen those follow-up methods, and why are you looking, at that point, what are you looking for in terms of safety, but also performance from the device? And really ultimately proving that the performance either increases or remains the same throughout the duration. or where there is a reduction in performance, which can typically happen with certain devices, what is that expected and is that justified? So really consideration in the documentation there. The study duration should also be sufficient to reflect the device under investigation, and a justification should be considered alongside the results as to why the data intervals were conducted at the chosen time periods. Last but certainly not least is study location. So as a notified body, we really look for information here about where those studies were located, and that is to meet the requirements mentioned within Annex 15 of the MDR that again represents, and we covered this earlier, but conducts clinical investigations are conducted in a clinical environment that is representative of the intended normal conditions of use. So when we think of study locations, we're not just thinking of geographical location, okay? We're not thinking about what country, what center, but also thinking about the type of environment of which that study was conducted, and some reference to that is always helpful to the notified body. So for example, we may see studies where typically they may be performed in a theatre, but we also know there are some devices that are actually, or some clinical investigations that are looking at trying to improve the efficiency of the clinical pathway and may be conducted in an alternative environment. So in this example, rather than a theatre, maybe a minor surgery room that's on a ward, or in a GP or family doctor setting. And again, tertiary care versus secondary care. Tertiary care centres typically have the expertise and backup procedures, certainly from cardiology. We know that certain devices are input into tertiary centres because they have the availability of cardiac surgery should anything go wrong. So really describe again about the types of location and consideration that where the study was conducted. It's important as well, to also think about the geographical locations as well. And even in the EU, there can be significant differences in patients, and really some justification about those differences should be addressed within the clinical evaluation report, particularly when discussing the results of those clinical investigations. So for example, in the Netherlands, we know they are the tallest nation in the world versus other areas perhaps in Europe where perhaps that height is a mean height of that country is very different. So again, those considerations should be thought about. Also think about the difference in surgical techniques or post-operative clinical differences between countries. Sometimes there can be different ways to implant a device or perform a diagnostic test, and the actual pathway of the patient after that surgery or after that diagnosis test, and really think about the differences that may exist in terms of the analysis of your clinical investigation data. Sometimes there is sort of national or society guidance that confirms the location or even the skill set of the user of the device and post-operative care for such procedures, and really, try to confirm and support that in terms of saying that your study has followed this pathway, which has been identified by the European Society of Cardiology or by the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, for example. And of course, there are some other things to think about in this area because that sort of feed out into the bigger parts of the clinical evaluation report, but also consider if the device is novel, how will you address the rollout if it's CE marked? We've had a few devices come through BSI, which are very unique, very highly specialist skill set devices, and reflect maybe a small number of users, expert users. And really you need to think about, is there something that you need to think about in terms of rolling out that device to the bigger market in terms of safety and performance, rather than just releasing it on the market and actually the people not having the training and education that's required to use that device. Some of this information can also feed into other parts. So in terms of what documentation do we need from you as a manufacturer in regards to your clinical investigations? Well, when you submit your clinical investigation and CER for your conformity assessment, this is the list of what we need. And it ranges from pretty much what we've talked about. There's some other ones in there to consider, such as investigators brochure and some evidence of public registration, if that's applicable. If it's on clinicaltrials.gov, then again, some reference there. We know obviously EUDAMED is yet to be fully functioning in this area, but when it is, we certainly expect evidence of public registration of those clinical investigations conducted in Europe into EUDAMED. And that is called out within the clinical evaluation assessment report template that's been provided by the European Commission. If there are any deviations to protocol, we know that things tend to change through time. Maybe there's a slight change in the numbers, the follow-up of these patients. Really make sure that you have some evidence of those deviations, and original copies of original and changed protocol should always be provided. And we do know occasionally there is some missing documentation. If that should ever occur, then always provide an explanation. I think it's Annex E of ISO 14155 in particular that talks about a huge list of documents that are required to be considered as part of a clinical investigation. Sometimes it's just good to let us know if there's anything in there that actually hasn't been collected, and a justification as to why you chose not to use that particular documentation, or why there is an exemption, for example. Just really going to point out one thing in regards to clinical investigations, particularly that's mentioned in Article 61.7, which is often overlooked by manufacturers. And it talks about the fact that when clinical investigations are not conducted for Class 3 and implantable devices, as seen on the list that we said at the start of the presentation around those that may be claiming equivalence or modifications by a manufacturer of a device already marketed, then there really needs to be a statement within the clinical evaluation report. It's surprising how many times we see these manufacturers claiming equivalence within their clinical evaluation report, but we don't see a clear statement addressing Article 61.7. So just something to look out for. So finally, some tips when documenting clinical investigations. We've given you the 7 areas that we really do focus on. So make sure that in your clinical evaluation report, you really are picking up each of these points and almost justifying your justification, if that's such a phrase, but really just try to sort of give the depth, history, and the reason and rationale as to why you've chosen each of these points and what those results are showing in terms of patient population, patient numbers, objectives, and endpoints, etc. So I think I've just said that, but yeah, always provide a list of the documents mentioned in slide 14 for each investigation. And then again, any missing or incomplete information should have a clear and robust explanation. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about clinical investigations. We're now going to touch upon stratification of data and analysis. One of the big things, why clinical evaluation reviews perhaps take so long with I think all notified bodies, in fairness, is because we have to really go in and search for information. And when we're looking for that information, we're making sure that, of course, it really does cover all of these questions. Is the data covering all device variants? Is it covering all the indications? What is that actual data source and quality of that sort of data source for that particular variant? Does that even variant of maybe 100 devices, is there enough to cover the lifetime? Has that been picked up in post-market clinical follow-up? Really, you can see the amounts of questions that we're looking at, and we have to sort of look for each variant and make sure that's called out to us as notified bodies as part of the clinical evaluation assessment report, really to make sure that you have sufficient data for all variants and sizes. So these are the questions that we have to ask ourselves. So what I would say is that in your clinical evaluation report, it is really important that if you want a quicker, more efficient review from a notified body, you really need to think about how you stratify that data within the clinical evaluation report, taking in consideration what's been identified in literature, what's coming from post-market surveillance, what's actually coming from clinical investigations, and stratify that data within your clinical evaluation report. Essentially, because if you do that, it saves us time doing it, because certainly in our orthopedic team, where there are many devices with many variants and many configurations, they have to go through and just make sure that there is sufficient data to support all those variants and all those variants in all those indications. So really, if you spend the time in your clinical evaluation report actually writing up and demonstrating stratification of data for all those, it will have efficiency in the review. So it also helps provide transparency between the reviewer and the manufacturer, particularly when there are many variants of device. So that's one of the benefits of it. This often results in fewer questions from the notified body, because we can instantly see, once you've stratified that data, where your gaps are and where you've addressed those in your PMCF plan. And even for you as a manufacturer, performing this exercise really does give you insight into the data you hold and where perhaps you need to perform specific or general PMCF activities to really come back and then solidify the data you hold across the range of devices that you have for all the indications. Stratification of data can be applied to all variants for all classifications, so it's not just class 3 and implantable devices. This can be considered across the board. And what it does is say it can easily see where the reviewer can immediately see where there are areas of data that may need to be supported by PMCF activities. When presented in a table format or Excel sheet, this is really beneficial to the reviewer. And I've got an example on the next slide that will show you that. But just to say that we do have some manufacturers that submit their clinical evaluation report and they do reference an Excel sheet where they actually have all this information listed within the stratified within that Excel sheet. And that instantly is a win. And yeah, what I will say is reviewers really get excited, believe it or not, when they see things laid out in that way, because it makes their life a lot easier. And they can instantly have transparency of the data that you hold. So what does this type of table look like? And I'm going to say thank you to Andrew Butler in the orthopedic team, one of our principal clinical reviewers, who has provided this for this webinar today. Really, what we're looking for is the variant to be listed with a brief description, and if needed, an image. And then really think about what are the data sources and the quality of those data sources and where those can be found in your clinical evaluation report. That instantly sets us in the direction if we need to get any more information. Then really a summary of all the safety data that you hold from all the sources of clinical data for that particular variant. And also then think about the performance data. Also, how does that compare to state of the art in terms of whether the clinical data gathered for the variant is aligned to the objective data gathered from the state of the art search? Then think about, are there any claims that need to be supported, and what is the data that you hold for each of those variants? We know that perhaps certain variants may have certain claims, particularly if they're variants that are supporting a specific patient population or a specific stage of disease. Also making sure that for devices where there are multiple indications, really to look at whether the variant is covering, the data that you hold is covering each of those indications that may be assigned. And also looking at the lifetime of the data that's held for that specific variant and what a follow-up appropriate may be required in terms of the type of PMCF activity that you can gather that data. And also think about compatibility. Whenever you claim compatibility to other devices, then obviously evidence and data needs to be provided. Sometimes that is technical data, but sometimes that is also clinical data, and consideration here about that variant and where its compatibility data is demonstrating that it is applicable to another type of device, for example. And of course, certain variants might have certain risks. Maybe the bigger the variant, maybe there's an increased risk. If I think of coronary stents, certainly the bigger they get in terms of length, then there's clinical data that suggests that there is an increased risk of thrombosis. So really, you might want to think about how that reflects any new risks observed, or is there any emerging or potentially additional increase in risk for that variant. And like I say, this is what we really do as a notified body for when you submit a device that has variants and multiple indications. It's really just trying to make sure that we can sufficiently answer this. Like I say, I really want to sort of emphasize this, but this is so beneficial to us as reviewers in terms of efficiency as well. And I think for you as manufacturers, it's beneficial really to sort of lay out what all the data that you hold for all of your variants, and then start to plug the gaps with appropriate PMCF activities if that's appropriate. So there are some considerations where we have to think about data in special and difficult situations, of course, and some of you may have seen that MDCG 22-14 does talk about the need for clinical data, or how do we address clinical data for orphan devices, etc. We know that this is an issue that for devices that are rarely used or have low volume, that sometimes the data, sufficiency of data might be there in terms of quality, but may not be there in terms of quantity. And really, how do we approach that? Well, as I said, we know that it can occur. We know this is a big issue sometimes for manufacturers with different, with a range of variants of devices. We know typically the center of that range has normally sufficient clinical data in terms of in terms of quantity and quality. But when you look at that spectrum of device sizes, for example, we know that those at the end of the spectrum of that size range tend to have less quality, more still quality, but less quantity in terms of sufficiency. We know this is an issue. So really, you have to make sure that you provide a justification. It's interesting because, Article 61.1 really talks about it's you as the manufacturer that needs to provide the justification for the sufficiency of clinical evidence to support your device. And really, we know that when that happens and you have these devices at the extreme end of the range, that really, what we're looking for is a good solid justification with ideally some evidence to support that. So evidence that could be used, for example, where perhaps the device is seldomly used, could include the sales volumes. You may say, well, we've only sold 12 of this size range last year, and the previous year it was 6. So you can see that we're not going to get this sufficiency of data that we need, but we do have the quality data and we do have some evidence to suggest this, and we are addressing it in our post-market clinical follow-up plan to have increased or to gather more data to support that. And again, one area as well for rare conditions, for example, is to look at, what is the incidence of that disease? If that incidence of that disease is that 1 in 2 million people are impacted and this device is going to help them, will point us to the clinical and scientific data that shows us that that demonstration of incidence is correct, and then use that as your justification. But we do know that many manufacturers are struggling in these areas where perhaps they don't have high volume, but really it's about the justification, and that's exactly what the notified body is looking for. So we're going to talk a little bit about broad indication devices, and so we've got a poll question for you here. For a device with a broad indication such as a CT scanner, is evidence required to support every possible indication? So we've just released that poll, and we'll give yourselves a few seconds to complete that. So for a CT scanner, is evidence required to support every possible indication? So I think, given that it's a yes or no option, I think we'll probably, in the interest of time, as we've only got 20 minutes left, we'll close that up.
No, yeah. Absolutely, Richard. Okay, fairly close actually. 56% have said yes and 44% have said no.
Okay. I think the reality is no. And I think the reason we say that is that, if you think about patient populations and indications, if you have a CT scanner that is looking for certain type of bleed, is it going to look for a certain type of bleed? Are you going to have evidence for every single patient in that, every single age of patient? Are you going to have for where it's used maybe to look at some leg or toe issues? Then, are you going to have data from patient populations? And it really is difficult for broad indication devices. And some of these, we see on the screen here, things diathermy using basic surgical instruments. These things could be used on anyone at any point for any possible reason. And so it is difficult to demonstrate that. So what's the best way to look at this? Well, we know there are some medical devices that serve all populations and all anatomical areas. An example of this would be an X-ray machine or CT scanner. And it would probably be impossible for you as a manufacturer to provide data for every population type and every anatomical location. So really, the trick is to sort of focus on and provide evidence of where perhaps your device is most commonly used. So if we take, for example, a CT scanner, you'll see here I've taken the top 7 lists of where the CT scanner may be potentially used, and that's evidenced from, I think it was some national website of CT scanners or National Society that did an investigation of where things are going. So examining small bones like the toe. Really, if you focus, your heavy weighting of data and data collection to support the most common indications, then really that's an acceptable approach. We know that there will be some times where perhaps there are things that are less commonly used, and again thinking of that incidence, but again some justification to support those indications is all we need to see as a notified body. Of course, it is worth noting though that with broad indication devices, if their intended purpose has a specific consideration, then really think about things like MRI. Then really we will need to have evidence to support that as well. So when I'm saying this, I'm saying, if there is a device that is MRI conditional or can be used in an MR environment, then really we need some evidence to support claims on that for a specific conditional population. So really, if you can, tips when documenting stratification data, providing tabulated data for each variant while covering the aspects mentioned in slide 20 will make the review process efficient. Where there are devices or variants that are seldomly used, consider supporting your justification with condition incidents or sales volumes to demonstrate the rare use of the device. And Article 61, paragraph 1, really just to emphasize it's your responsibility as a manufacturer to give us that robust justification as to why you still think there is sufficient data to support such incidents where devices may be seldomly used. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about benefit risk. So benefit risk, of course, is different for every device, and on the screen now you see, various instances or proportions or ratios of where risks consider. So the top end we have a syringe which has great benefit in the ability to deliver a drug, but also it has some very small risks, but those are very different to what we see at the bottom of the screen, where, for instance, a left ventricular assist device is a very complex device that carries high risks, even for the duration of the patient's life of while they had it implanted. So the risk of stroke is very high in these patients. So benefit risk will differ between each device type. And really that sort of a approach to benefit risk needs to be considered based on the device and its classification as well, and intended purpose, of course. Really, when you think about benefit risk assessment, you should think about everything that really falls under benefit risk. And here I've tried to sort of think of all the different areas that will impact benefit risk. How invasive a device is, where the anatomical location is, and really that needs to come through in your benefit risk statement about your device. One of the common things we often see, and quite frustratingly, we've done a very good review of your clinical evaluation report. You've got fantastic data supporting all variants, all indications, and then we just see these sort of simple statements in the clinical evaluation report. A simple statement saying that the benefit risk profile is acceptable. Really, that is not the purpose of a benefit risk assessment. Benefit risk statements need to consider all available evidence and really think about the overall picture. And this really does help to pull in all the areas of your assessment, so all that clinical data, sort of bring it together and start to highlight the conclusions that you're making from that data that support both benefits and also justify the acceptance of those risks. And really what we're looking for is good, solid arguments that are presented within your clinical evaluation report. Within the benefit risk as well, it should be given to state of the art. How does your device compare to the treatment and diagnostic options that are still available? So where we started our clinical masterclass on the clinical evaluation plan, really bring through those objectives and demonstrate why your device is state of the art within your benefit risk profile, and demonstrate why it's acceptable. So what are we looking for in a notified body benefit risk? Well, it's important to think that when you describe benefit risk, you consider it per indication. The benefit risk ratio or assessment will be different for every indication. Some indications will have greater benefit, and some indications will have less benefit, but may still outweigh risk. And it's important that when you describe your benefit risk, you don't take these bold sort of general statements. You actually start to think about each of the indications that exist. And really tell the story behind how you've got here. Think about all the data in your clinical evaluation report. Also think about the magnitude of the benefits that are being presented to you as well, in terms of duration as well. And we talked a little bit about the magnitude of benefit in that clinical evaluation plan and webinar, thinking about duration and quantity of benefit. Also, there are benefits as well to the actual users of the device. Maybe there's less exposure to x-rays for the doctor during a cardiac catheterization. Really think about the bigger picture as well, not just the patient in terms of describing your benefit risk. Also, benefit risk assessment required for all devices and can be proportionate to the classification of the device. So, whilst we saw on the other screen a basic syringe, for example, a benefit risk assessment there is going to be quite limited because there is limited benefit and there are very small risks. But of course, when you start to talk about more complex, class 3 implantable devices, really the notified body is looking for a good, clear argument for those points that we've mentioned. And think about the patient pathway and the context of the device when considering alternative options. And again, think about the magnitude of benefit. Often, people think about the immediate benefits of a device, whether that's a diagnostic or a device required to treat a condition, for example, but there are magnitude of benefits in terms of duration. And what is that duration? At 10 years, are patients going to still have the same amount of benefit? Is that benefit going to increase? And trying to bring all that into your benefit risk argument. So some tips really, the best benefit risk assessments are typically performed by those with a medical qualification. Some of the best clinical evaluation reports we see are written by, or certainly not reports, but the benefit risk statement are written by the doctors that implant or the nurses that are involved with these devices. The reason I say that is because these people are making benefit risk assessments every day. When they go to see a patient on a ward, for example, they make that benefit risk in their head about, actually, this patient has these comorbidities, exposing them to this procedure is going to increase this potential risk. If you can sort of get into the mind of a clinician when writing your benefit risk assessment, or even get a clinician to write it, those are typically much better statements. And again, as I said, really think about the magnitude and duration of benefit, and also the risks over the lifetime of the user and patient device, particularly where perhaps risks diminish over time as well. That's also helpful in terms of your benefit risk statement and assessment. We know that typically devices with a higher classification will have more risks, so therefore a more direct benefit, and this should be evidenced by the data collected. The benefit risk assessment will consider all aspects of the device and all data. So really think about the device as a whole, a almost holistic approach. And again, my clear message, do not do one-line statements. They are never helpful, and they'll often invite scrutiny from the notified body. So we're going to talk a little bit about Article 6110, and Article 6110 is those devices that are that's where clinical data is deemed inappropriate. Article 6110, we did do a webinar last year on those devices and what we're actually looking for as part of the first clinical masterclass. So please go back and listen to those. Before we move on, we do have another poll for you. So here's a question: do devices following Article 6110 still require a clinical evaluation report? So we'll give you a few moments on that. Okay. I think, Natalie, in the interest of time, we'll close that one and see what the results
absolutely. are. Yeah, I think there's a clear winner there. We have 94% have said yes and 6% have said no.
Oh, well done to the 94%. Give yourselves a pat on the back. It is, in fact, yes. All Article 6110 devices still require a clinical evaluation report. Even though clinical data may be deemed inappropriate, there are still some things that need to be considered within your clinical evaluation report. So some general considerations for us about these devices when writing your clinical evaluation report. We know that typically for these devices, the evidence is going to be coming from preclinical, bench testing data, animal study data, etc. And that should really be reflected in your technical documentation of all the types of tests that you've done, and some reference to to those tests within your clinical evaluation report is always helpful. We are required to produce you with a clinical evaluation assessment report as part of this for these devices that undergo conformity assessment, and that's documented within the MDR. So, we do see sometimes some rationale saying that, well, we've not provided you a clinical evaluation report because we're following Article 6110. Well, that's incorrect. You'd still need a clinical evaluation report, and we will still provide a clinical evaluation assessment report. What we really want to sort of emphasize today for these devices is within the clinical evaluation report, we really need a clear logical justification and rationale as to why you're following Article 6110. We know that when we get audited by our competent authorities, they're going to want to understand why we accepted this route to Article 6110 for this device. And really, you have to look at Article 6110 to sort of understand what it is you need to include in your justification. And listening back to our earlier webinar on Article 6110 will give you some ideas about how to describe the interaction with the patient. If the interaction is limited, maybe that's acceptable. You are making no clinical claims outside of the intended purpose, for example. These things all need to be considered, and a justification needs to be clearly provided as to why you're following Article 6110. It is worth saying, though, you still need to produce a clinical evaluation plan, because you need to define those GSPRs that could need clinical data, or justify why they don't need clinical data. We still expect a clinical evaluation report. We also expect a PMCF plan and a PMS plan. I think this statement is quite clear that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So even though they're Article 6110, you still need to perform some aspects of a literature search, for example, to prove that there is no data, there is no clinical data out there on your device. So again, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So there is still a requirement for a clinical evaluation plan and a clinical development plan, and it's understood that these will be limited, and we'll discuss how the GSPRs can be met in the absence of clinical data. So we expect, for example, that you to perform a literature search, because you still need to define what is state of the art. Is this particular type of method for, even a fridge for storing insulin? What are the actual appropriate methods today for storing an insulin? Is there something that says, a certain temperature range, etc.? That sort of literature search as well can help provide you and demonstrate the GSPR against state of the art. We know, though, of course, that sometimes there is these devices are not typically reported in literature. And so, if there is any evidence or there is no evidence, then make sure that you always consider a justification or explanation as to why you can still be considered state of the art. Again, a literature search should still be performed of the device under evaluation, because really you never know that maybe last year somebody reported and mentioned the name of your device in relation to a certain clinical risk. And again, if that data, if you don't look for it, you don't know that that data is out there. So it's important that you show evidence that you've searched to make sure that the device under evaluation has been considered. And really, within the clinical evaluation report, consider a summary of the type of preclinical data that you've used to conduct your and demonstrate conformity to the GSPRs with reference to the technical documentation. So PMCF under the MDR contains both general and specific activities. Given the nature of the device, it's unlikely that specific activities will be conducted as part of the PMCF plan. General activities include feedback from users of the device, and this is an activity that could be appropriate for Article 6110 devices. So yeah, under the MDR, PMCF doesn't mean a post-market study. It means both general and specific activities, which includes how are you going to get feedback from users of the device. So typically for these devices, we do expect a PMCF plan that considers the general PMCF activities mentioned in Annex 14, Part B, and also a robust justification for not conducting specific PMCF activities. What happens if you do identify data? Well, yeah, it does happen that, an Article 6110 device goes looking and finds some information. Really, it can still be possible to claim Article 6110 for these devices. Even when there is clinical data out there, because that clinical data may not be sufficient to demonstrate conformity to the GSPRs. So you might need to think about, okay, well, we'll continue with Article 6110, but we are aware there is data out there and we have considered this data as part of this assessment. Of course, yeah, if the clinical data is sufficient, then it may be that moment in time where you say, well, actually, there is data out there on our device. Maybe now we can meet the GSPRs with sufficient quality of data. So therefore, maybe that's the point in time where you stop actually following Article 6110 and you start to move forward to claiming clinical or having clinical data to support your GSPRs. It's not acceptable to ignore any clinical data in the evaluation of a 6110 device. Okay, so if there is clinical data out there, it needs to be considered. So here are some tips. Really provide a robust justification as to why you're following Article 6110. A clinical evaluation plan is always required alongside a clinical development plan, but we know the GSPRs that are identified will typically for clinical data will mention the use of preclinical data is more appropriate. A literature search on state of the art and the device under evaluation to demonstrate there is no clinical data on the device, and a summary and reference to the supporting preclinical data is required in the clinical evaluation report. And also a PMCF plan is always required, but will typically only mention general activities with a justification for not conducting specific activities. And if clinical data has been identified, do not exclude it. Just mention that you've considered it and how that, and what its sufficiency is, or where there is a lack of sufficiency to be able to use that data to meet the GSPRs. So I'm going to quickly, for the last 2 minutes, talk about consideration of updates of activities to the CER. So we've talked about in the last 3 webinars about the fact that the clinical evaluation process is a continuous process, and the CER is the output of that process. And there will be many activities that feed into your clinical evaluation process, such as your post-market clinical follow-up, and what feeds out of that is also the evaluation reports. And sometimes they can be requirements to other documentation. So it's really important to think about the bigger picture. The documentation really, even though we have our QMS procedures, it's very clear in your documentation that we need to see that strong link between the clinical evaluation, risk management, and post-market surveillance. And here I've got a slide that sort of talks about this. in terms of what we're expecting and the processes to think about. So the first one is really thinking about that there is an interconnection and a continuous connection between your clinical evaluation and risk management. So whatever data you're driving for your clinical data will need to feed into your risk management. And it's the output of that as well that you might define what activities you need to conduct as part of your post-market surveillance plan. And as part of your post-market surveillance plan, you need to have a post-market clinical follow-up plan, okay? So that will talk about the general and specific activities. But also feeding into your PMCF plan from your risk management and identify of activities is, of course, those unanswered questions that you hold from your clinical data. Maybe there's something on a specific variant that you need to gather. And it's the output of those activities from your post-market surveillance plan and your post-market clinical plan that follow into your post-market clinical evaluation report. Stay with me. And those updates of results from the PMCF activities feed back into your clinical evaluation plan and reports. So really, whatever you've conducted, the information you identified needs to go back into your clinical evaluation plan and be considered as a whole. But also your PMCF evaluation report needs to feed into your periodic safety update report or your PMS report if you're a class 1 device. That information, the main findings of PMCF need to be identified there, along with, of course, the outputs of your post-market surveillance plan. And really the output of your report should also feed into your risk management to make sure that your device is, of course, continually behaving as it should be in terms of safety and performance. But some of those results of your post-market results need to also go into your clinical evaluation as well. And what we get here is obviously whenever you update your clinical evaluation plan for your class 3 and implantable devices, you will need to update your SSCP as well. Anytime you update your clinical evaluation report, really think about the impact that will have, and do you need to communicate that information to your healthcare practitioners or your patients via your SSCP? And without saying, this is the last bit, I promise, but really think about those updates to labeling as well from all of these activities, updates to your clinical evaluation plan, your risk management, and your PSUR and PMS report. So always consider the inputs and outputs of the clinical evaluation process. These should be formalized within your QMS procedures. Consideration to updates of documentation should be considered in terms of important new information and how impact it is to the patients and users of the device. The MDR does provide some consideration about what those expected timelines should be for each of those stages. There can sometimes be acceptable reasons to delay updates, such as updates to SSCP and PSURs, and these should be clearly documented within your procedures. For more information about this, then make sure you listen to our SSCP and PSUR sessions that are scheduled this year. We've had a lot of questions asking, how do I go back and listen to the Series 1 Masterclass? We did 5 topics then of different aspects of the MDR, and here is the link for that. And please join us for our next session, where Simon Lydgate and Nicholas Harbord-Smith, who are very experienced clinical reviewers at BSI, will be talking specifically about PMCF plans and PMCF evaluation reports. And there is more information available from our website. Okay, I'm conscious that we've got a few minutes for questions.
That's great. Thank you, Richard. Yeah, we have a few minutes. We can get through a couple, I think. So let's start. Is there a need to quantify benefit risk as it is reported as a ratio?
Good question. So when you think about benefit risk, I'll be honest with you, I don't think we're there as a group of manufacturers, notified bodies, authorities to really sort of be in the process of quantifying risk. You can quantify it, and that's always helpful, but I think what we need to address really as a bigger, wider group is how do we quantify that, and what is the acceptable method of quantifying benefit risk? And I think once we get sort of an endorsement of an approach there, then I do think that will probably work, and we should then look at quantifying benefit risk. You can do it, but it's not expected in terms of a quantification. More of a qualitative description is just as acceptable.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Let's do 2 more. Okay, so is there a need to repeat the literature search every year for Article 6110 devices, please?
Well, I think every year could be a stretch, but you do need to repeat the literature search on a frequency that you have defined within your clinical evaluation report in terms of updates, because there could be evidence that's being published or produced out there on the device. And also you need to confirm whether your device is still state of the art. So you need to think about what that timeline looks like and justify that timeline. For Article 6110 devices, they are 2A, 2B non-implantable devices. So therefore, there could be class 1. So therefore, it is, they are lower risk, so it could be justified to consider a longer timeline to conduct those literature searches.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. And I'll just squeeze in one more question. Can you provide an example of what a justification could look like for extreme variance, and how can we evidence that with lack of data, please?
Yeah, I think I went through a little bit of this on the slides, but I think where there are variants that are where there's a lack of data because they are seldomly used, not because there's a lack of data because you haven't taken the appropriate actions to collect that data, then that justification really could be referenced through sales volumes, through incidence of the condition, and really describing that argument as to why you have that limited data. I think, but also think about when justifying, think about the quality of that data that you do hold, and so show how that is evidence and demonstrates to meet the intended purpose of the device. And also think about addressing things like that in your PMCF plan, where perhaps you know that device will continue to be seldomly used, but every time it is used, you're going to set up a registry specifically to capture that data on that particular variant.
Brilliant, thank you, Richard. That was really, really helpful, really insightful. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. So I'd like to say thank you to Richard and to Sheila for all their help answering those questions as well in the background. And thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Once you leave the webinar, you'll receive a short survey on your experience today, and we'd be really grateful if you just take a few minutes to complete this with your feedback. You'll also receive a follow-up email within the next 48 hours with a link to view the recording of the webinar and the slides. And the recording will also be available on our BSI Medical Devices LinkedIn page. So on behalf of BSI, thank you for joining us today and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.